What's good everyone, my name is Sonic and I'm finally back for another video after an unfortunate and involuntary break from posting. My graphics card died and I had to wait nearly a month for it to get RMA'd back to me, but not to worry, I have been keeping up on the Rumbleverse news and even playing it most nights, but just on an older laptop. I couldn't record anything because I was already playing on the lowest possible settings. But anyway, I wanted to create a discussion and hear your thoughts about the topic of today, which is early fights in Rumbleverse and why you should actually avoid them. This came to my mind for a few reasons recently, which I'll outline briefly before we begin. I took part in a few community nights that are hosted by Tupperware on Tuesdays, and I was also able to sneak into the final open night of the big graphical competitive event that took place this past week. In both cases, a lot of well-known streamers and high-tier players jump into a private match and see how they fare against each other. It's a really tough lobby, and any fight you take could be your last in this match because everybody is super strong. I highly encourage you look it up and try joining it on Tuesdays if you want to see how you stack up against some of the best players in the game, and I will link to his stream in the description. One of the players who participates in these events goes by Lariat God on Twitter. He has a couple of other names in the game, but his tweet is really what got me thinking about this topic after vaguely feeling this way already. I'll put it up on the screen here, but I want to focus on the second part of his comment first because this is absolutely true. He said, "You have to get your 10 not to be handicapped in the final circle, and the only way to do that is by actively avoiding players for the early part of each match." Now when he says 10, he's talking about pods, and that's all of your stat points basically, so yeah, it's totally true. And with that in mind, and with my experience playing against highly competitive players, I started thinking about how does this apply to casual games as well. So let's break this down into 3 sections and keep it simple. First, what makes early fights a bad idea if you actually want to win the game? Second, we're going to go into what features are already in the game that attempt to address this. And finally, what I would personally change to make early fights a more viable strategy. So first up, when you're playing against the best players around, loot in general actually becomes extremely rare. Every player wants and needs to get their stats up to win the game, and if you spend time fighting early in the game, it almost guarantees that you won't get anything, or sorry, everything that you need later in the game. So in competitive games, it's very common to actually just run past people and hope to find more crates that somebody missed. Like, you've got your little looting area at the beginning, and then you can run and you'll find people, and you just want to get crates. Like, you just need stats. Now I remember a comment that was made by the lead combat designer of the game, Keats, a while back, and to simplify it, and paraphrase it probably, one of the key differences between lower skilled players and high skilled players is the number of boxes that they open. Good players open more boxes throughout the course of a match, and I forget the number that he estimated, but it was probably like twice as many or so, and casuals on the other hand are more likely to just open up a few crates and then get into a fight. In competitive games, that absolutely seems to be the truth. Before the first circle closes in, there likely isn't a single unbroken box left on the map because everybody wants to find their pods, and they avoid other players oftentimes to get them. There's no other way to do it because there's so many people, all looking to max their stats out. On the other hand, it's usually not too difficult to find the stats you want in the casual solo games, but getting in early fights certainly leads to times where you might just have to pick up the pods that you don't actually want to take. Legs. Because that's all that's left. Now I mostly play duos with a friend when I play Rumbleverse, where this issue can actually be even more pronounced. It's pretty common for an early game fight to last quite a while because just beating one opponent is not enough. They might get revived multiple times and you might too before you end up finally winning. And all that time you spend not looting means you're behind the rest of the lobby, and all that commotion often leads other teams to you very shortly after you're done too. I've had multiple times where I've chained 3 or even 4 team fights one after another with only enough time to heal, if even that, between fights. Surviving those continuous battles is a thrill like no other game can provide, but when the dust finally settles, you still have to hope there's enough crates left to get the stats that you need. And you have to split the available stats with a partner too. Now perks certainly help, but I don't think there are any perks in the game right now that can make up for the benefit of having an extra 60% health or damage overall. Now aside from loot scarcity, the next major culprits that make early fights bad is the circle itself. It's an important part of how battle royales work, of course, because if the players weren't forced to come together and fight, then some would just hide in the bushes the whole day, or avoid fights until they had exactly all the stats that they wanted and the moves that they wanted every single game, So there would be little variety there. There would be no forced decisions or anything like that. And it would become boring. Like, you could end up with games where they just wouldn't finish because people aren't looking for fights. So of course that's an important way that BR games work. But the first circle in Rumbleverse comes on quite fast. So if you are pulled into an early game fight, you're almost certainly missing all of the loot outside the first circle. And heck, even if you don't fight, the circles shrink fast enough that you might not be able to get the stats or the boxes that you want anyway. And there's just not a lot of time to loot in the first part of there, because I think it's like a minute and a half or so, and that counter starts when you get shot out from the cannon, so you still have a few seconds to land there too. So now, with this background information, what should we do about it? Well, if you wanted the best chance of winning the game, the short answer is don't fight at the beginning of the match. And that's kind of unfortunate. Just let people do their own thing and loot up until you've got the stats you need to, or at least you're close to being maxed out and your pocket's full of whatever you kids carry these days. This isn't always the most fun thing to do, of course. So let's talk about what the developers included in the game already to encourage interaction instead of just popping pods until you're ready to burst. So now we get to perks. Mentioned them before, and I'm sure everyone listening knows what they do by now, but the more damage you deal, the more character-altering perks you get. This is the primary reason to interact with other players throughout the match, because some of the perks that you can get are very strong and they can change how you play the match entirely. I'm not going to go through specific perks now because I'm sure you already know what they mean as well at this point. But what's important is that Rumbleverse devs added probably the best system in any game I've seen yet to encourage players to be aggressive and interact with each other at any point in the game. It's great that these are here. They're very important to have at the end of the game. But as I've mentioned before, though, they don't necessarily make up for the lack of pods. Your stats are very important. The next thing that forces you to interact is, of course, the circle itself, pushing you in closer to anyone who's left in the match still. When rumblers get close to each other, they tend to throw hands. There's not much else to say here because it's a staple of BR games at this point. You know what it does already. You get counted out if you stay outside the circle. And that is one of the least fun ways to lose, but it's also the most fun way to beat someone else in some cases. And once the circle starts closing in, though, there are multiple times during the match where new crates will come down from the sky and help those who might be missing a few pods, or if you need a fresh supply of squats right after a fight. This is great in theory, and it should be enough to get you the last few items you need, but that's not always the case. Often it is, not always the case, though. Sometimes you don't get what you want out of them. And hey, it's a BR, so randomness is part of it, but other times you'll already be in a fight too, and by the time it's done, all the new boxes are already gone. So it's just, could be bad timing, really. Still, this is probably the best fix, if you can call it that, that's available in the game right now, because it introduces new loot to the match after it has already started. And there's quite a bit of it too, so it's not just like a single focus point where, you know, one crate comes down and everybody has to fight over that. The last incentive to fight is that, assuming you beat them, of course, they're going to drop moves and items that they were holding, which you can potentially use to upgrade yourself. That doesn't always happen. They might not have something you want, they might not have something you can use, but at least they drop something. Usually it will allow you to heal yourself and prepare for the next fight because everybody keeps checking on them. You can often get weapons and stuff, but rarely do people hold pods in the game right now. Usually only happens if you're fighting either a bot, they tend to hold pods for whatever reason, or if you're fighting in the mid to late game and that person has a perk called the burn, so you're still low on stats if you fight early. Overall, these are great features within the game, and they certainly help in some ways, but they might not always be enough. Going back to the highly competitive lobbies for a moment, we were finding that out of a lobby of 38 total players, the game supports up to 40, of course, but 1 or 2 spots were reserved for people doing commentary in those matches. It was extremely common for the final circle to contain more than 20 people still. And actually, the record so far has been 30 out of 38 people in the final circle, which is pretty small and extremely chaotic, because if you fought early, that meant you lacked stats going into the end of the game with the best players in the world, effectively. So it's absolute chaos, to say the least, because it's just far too many people in a small space, and because everybody collectively has decided that getting stats is more important than anything else, fighting early just puts you at a strict disadvantage in that sense, just plain and simple. In casual lobbies, it seems like 10 plus person final circles is fairly common, and in duos matches I'd say having 6 teams left is pretty standard, so a total of 12-ish people left. It's still quite a bit of people for a small circle, but I don't really see that changing and ideally reducing unless some changes are made to make aggressive play a bit better and more viable overall. How could we do that? Well, I'm glad you asked. But before I give you my suggestions, hit the comments section and tell me what you do to make early fights more viable in Rumbleverse to avoid spoilers. Okay, so finally now, let's get back to Larry God's tweet that started this all. The first part of this tweet is also my first suggestion, and you'll see a comment I made when I read it originally too. If KOing an opponent resulted in one or more pods being dropped as well, then the time spent fighting instead of looting would potentially let you keep up with the rest of the lobby in terms of stats. They would likely still be ahead of you since looting is faster than fighting, but you'd also have some perks to balance that part out a bit. The pod or pods you get from winning a fight may not always be what you prefer, but at least it would be an option that you could use immediately to boost your stats before either fighting again or wandering off to finally get a chance to open up some boxes. As you see with my comment, I mentioned that sometimes I noticed when I was KO'd in duos matches, I dropped a pod that I wasn't holding onto in my inventory. My friend also noticed this too and pointed it out to me first, but it doesn't seem consistent, and actually I don't think I've noticed it for a little while now. Only bots would pretty consistently drop pods of some kind currently, which is nice and advances the idea that this could be possible. Since the bots regularly walk away from full chickens though, I wouldn't be surprised if they actually just picked up pods and held onto them instead of using them. But still, it's the right idea, I think. The second change I would like to see is to the first ring when the match starts. I don't think we specifically need more space to loot most of the time. I mean, there are a couple of very small circles when the game begins and half the circle is already in the water. That could be improved, but it's rare enough at least. The main change I'd make here is to add extra time before the first circle closes in. Give people the chance to loot around the edge of the circle a little bit longer to start before it's all unavailable, and make early fights possible to finish in time to still grab a few crates after. Now adding an extra 30 seconds onto that might be okay. It might also be too much time overall, I'm not sure, but I would say at least an extra 15 seconds would make a fair difference here. We don't want everyone getting all their stats and moves before they even see another player, of course, but what we have now punishes you pretty harshly for taking an early fight, even if you win it fast. The circle's just gone. Now the final and perhaps wackiest suggestion, which would probably alter the overall gameplay a fair bit too, is to allow multiple copies of the same book to upgrade a move. It's common in early fights to have 1 or even 2 green books because you might have been able to open a crate or 2 before your opponent came at you. And opponents are going to drop their green books if you beat them. So if you could combine multiple copies of the same move, there would be a small benefit to beating opponents early too, so that you might be able to upgrade your moves before the next fight. To do this though, there would also have to be a change to the overall loot pool to make blue and purple books even more rare, because at any point you could also do the same thing when you're looting. Could be fun, might not work, not sure. It would be a big change for sure, but it would make the green books themselves more valuable, I would think too. Overall, I'd stick with the first 2 suggestions first at least, because that's probably enough to make the early fights viable and achieve more reasonable player counts in the end circle. When the player count is too high, there's little to no room for combos and cool team plays, because extending anything past your first hit is usually an invitation for someone else to get their hits on you. So if we could reduce the amount of players, it would help a lot. It would make the end circles a bit more fun until right now, for example, when there's like 3 to 4 people left or 2 or maybe 3 teams left, that's when it gets exciting again. You know, everybody's just hopping around, hoping not to be targeted with some tracking grab pretty much. And that's not the most exciting. Anyway, that is it for me today. Let me know in the comments if you agree with any of my suggestions, or tell me what you'd do instead to encourage more early game fights if you had the power. Thank you for listening in, and I'll see you soon on the streets of Capital City.